I'm going to talk a little bit about capitalism and about the economic system we live in. And one of the interesting things that people don't know, one of these facts that is kind of astounding when you think about it, is that over the last 30 to 40 years, over 1 billion people, that's with a B, billion, right, have come out of poverty around the world. Over 1 billion people who used to make, think about this, used to make less than $1.90 a day, right? The minimum wage in the United States is 7 something. There are people out there in the world who make less than $2 a day. Well, the number of people who make less than $2 a day has shrunk by 1 billion people over the last 30 years. So we have 1 billion people less who are not poor anymore, or not that poor anymore. And nobody talks about this. And I think it's interesting to ask the question, why? How come 1 billion people, more than any number in all of human history, suddenly they were dirt poor and now they're rising, and many of them are becoming middle class. Many of them are going to school for the first time. Many of them are getting cars and getting homes for the first time. And what's happening in the world that would cause this? And what's happening is that in many countries that have never had freedom, that have never had free markets, where people have never had choices, where people have never had the ability to choose their profession, never had the ability to actually go and work. All they've done, what did people do before they had jobs? What did we, like even here in America or in Europe or really everywhere around the world, 250 years ago, what did we all do? What was the thing that we all did to survive? We farmed. We were all farmers. And we weren't farmers like modern farmers with big tractors and a lot of equipment, right? Because there was no such thing. We all farmed, little family farms. We planted the food that we ate, and we worked from when the sun rose to when the sun set. There was no electricity, there was no light, so we went to sleep when it was dark, woke up when the sun rose, went to work, and we ate everything we produced. And did we have anything left over? No, we had nothing left over. So it's called subsistence farming. And most of the world, until about 50 years ago, most of the world was subsistence farmers. Most of our ancestors were subsistence farmers. I'd say 90% of the population on the planet 250 years ago were subsistence farmers. We were all, everybody, dirt poor. We were all living at under $2 a day. And yet, 1 billion people have come out of that over the last 30 years, and it's all pretty much in Asia, in places like China, in places like India, in places like Vietnam, Korea, South Korea at least, in North Korea, they're still dirt poor. And the reason that's happened is that in all those places, we've introduced some freedom. We let people make choices for themselves. We let people choose what kind of profession they have. We let people choose what kind of business to open. People can actually open businesses where they were not allowed to in the past. And suddenly what's happened is standard of livings have gone through the roof. The same thing happened in the West, in Europe, in the United States, about 250 years ago. There's this amazing chart. If you look at all of human history, about 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago is about when human beings discovered agriculture. If you look at human history, our wealth and our income per capita, that is the wealth that each one of us, our families would have had, has been pretty stable for about 10,000 years. About $2 a day, right? Stays like this. And then suddenly, it goes like that. Suddenly, everybody becomes relatively rich, relatively wealthy, as compared to where we were before. And again, what happens there? What happened in the West 250 years ago? We had an industrial revolution. We suddenly had freedoms that we never had before. Before the establishment of this country, before 200 years ago, who made decisions for us? Who made decisions for the individual? Who did we live for? Who owned everything? Yeah. The what? You have to speak up. Yeah, so think about even before the colonial. So who made the decision even for the rich people in the colonial era? Who was the boss?
The British government.
The British government. What kind of government did the British have?
The king.
The king, right? Every country on the planet had some kind of king. They might not have called him a king, but they all had kings. You know, somebody who was the boss, who got to decide whatever. All the land was supposed to be owned by the king, by the ruler. We, as individuals, didn't count. We were owned, in a sense, by the government, and in this case, the government was a form of a king. And if you think about all of human history until about 200 years ago, throughout all of human history, there's been a king. There's been a tribal leader. There's been somebody who's been our, not just boss in the sense that we mean it today, where we can resign, right? We can quit. We don't like our job, we can go somewhere else. No, you couldn't leave, right? This king owned you. And 200 years ago, people stood up and said, enough. This is ridiculous. My life belongs to whom? To me. Nobody owns me. Now in America, they did this and at the same time held a contradiction because they kept slavery, right? So they had this contradiction. But it's still true that for the first time in human history, people stood up in America and said, no to kings. The government doesn't own us. The government is our servant. We own our own lives. We should decide our own fates. We should decide what we want to do. And it's interesting that about the same time as that happened, wealth, quality of life, standard of living went like that. Improved dramatically. Because the fact is that if you look throughout human history, wealth, income, standard of living are highly correlated, they're highly related to the amount of freedom allowed in society. When we are free to make our own decisions, when we're free to choose our own path in life, we succeed. We make stuff, we build stuff, we create, we innovate. When our lives belong to other people, when we're constrained, when we're told what we can and cannot do and everything, we don't produce, we don't create, we don't innovate. So there's a direct relationship between freedom, freedom of action, freedom of choice, freedom of thought, and between economic success. And you can see that all over the world. It doesn't matter what culture you come from, it doesn't matter what geographic area you come from. This is a phenomenon that exists almost universally. It doesn't even matter what period of history you come from. In the West, for example, we discovered this idea of freedom 200 years ago, and we started being successful. In Asia, they're discovering this idea of freedom more recently, and they're being successful economically. There are countries now in Africa that are adopting principles of free markets, principles of freedom, and they're being successful. So, everywhere it's tried, it doesn't matter, again, what geography, what ethnic group, what history. People, when they're free, prosper. When they're unfree, when they're constrained, when they're told what to do, they fail. And again, even in the West, we've tried all kinds of experiments around this. I mean, in Europe, they had communism for 70 years. Where they didn't have a king anymore, but they had the equivalent of a king. That some, dictator or ruler or set of committees that dictated every aspect of people's lives. And how did they do? Economically. Awful. They were dirt poor. They might have been all equal, but they were dirt poor. You guys know about the Berlin Wall? Talk about movies. I just saw the movie, Spielberg's new movie, Bridge of Spies. I don't know, anybody seen Bridge of Spies? It's worth seeing, just if only for the history, it's worth seeing, because they actually, in the movie, they show how the Berlin Wall is being built. And the Berlin Wall was built because people were escaping from communism to come to Western Europe, because communism was so bad that they had to build a wall to prevent them from escaping. And we in the West didn't realize how bad things were under communism until the wall came down in 1989. And then people went to East Germany and went to Russia, and they discovered how poor people were, how dirty everything was, how polluted everything was. We complain about pollution all the time here. But they were much more polluted than we are. By the way, why? Why do you think under communism things would be more polluted than under a system that we live under with private property? What do you tend to keep clean? I mean, I'm talking to teenagers, so I don't know if this is a good question to ask you. But what do your parents tend to keep tidy and clean? Their own stuff, right? You take care of your own lawn, you take care of your own home, you take care of your stuff. So when you have private property, it's taken care of. You take care of it. You have ownership, you have pride of ownership. When stuff is public, we'd like to think we would take care of it, but we don't treat it quite the same. Under communism, everything is public. So guess what happens? Nobody takes care of it. And it becomes filthy and dirty. And that's what they discovered when the Berlin Wall came down, and we traveled over there into East Germany, into Poland, into these other countries. They were filthy because everything was public property. Nobody took care of it. So one of the advantages of private property, of freedom, freedom to own your own stuff, freedom to do what you want with your stuff, is that it's actually clean. Now, when I talk about freedom, freedom from what? We use this word freedom a lot. Everybody's for freedom. Nobody's against freedom, right? But what do we mean, freedom from what? What is the opposite of freedom? What's the opposite of freedom? Yeah. Slavery. But slavery represents what? Because it's not only freedom of slavery. There are all kinds of opposites of freedom. What would be a general term for the things that are opposite of freedom? Oppression, right? Any kind of oppression. I would call it coercion, right? If I stick a gun at the back of your head and say, you've got to do X, Y, Z, otherwise I'm going to shoot you, are you free? No. So any type of coercion, any type of force is the opposite of freedom. So when I talk about freedom, I mean freedom from force, freedom from coercion. And what kind of world do we live in today? Do we live in a world in which there is some coercion, some freedom, all coercion? Where do we fall on that spectrum, do you think? 50-50, right? I don't know if it's 50-50, but it's a mixture, right? I don't know the exact level of mixture. Some things we're forced into doing. I pay my taxes. What happens if I don't pay my taxes? I go to jail. Some guy shows up with a gun and takes me to jail, right? It's coercion. They force me to go to jail. If you go practice a certain profession that the government has decided you need a license for, and you practice it without a license. You can't do that. So we live today in a system, particularly relative to our own history, that is very mixed. We have a lot of coercion, we have a lot of government telling us what we can and cannot do. A lot of it. Not as much as communism, certainly not as much as slavery, but also not as much as I would argue we had 100 years ago in terms of freedom. We were a lot less coerced 100 years ago than we are today, in terms of, at least in terms of economic freedom. And I argue, I think many people would argue, that that's why our economy struggles today. Our economy grows slowly today. It's because coerced people produce less, create less, build less. Where's most of the innovation happening today in our economy, in the world in which we live? Where do you see most new stuff coming out, most of the kind of exciting new products coming? Now we've got two guys who participate. Who else? Yeah.
A lot of them come from like Greece and Japan.
Well, think about the U.S. Where in the United States do you think most of the innovation comes? Yeah. Silicon Valley, exactly. And it's technology, right? They build this kind of stuff, right? You all have one of these. And this is the technology industry. This is high tech. And why do you think this stuff gets innovated all the time? Why do you think there's innovation here all the time? They're making new stuff, they're creating stuff, they're building stuff.
Because there's a huge demand for it.
There's a huge demand. That's true. But there's a huge demand for automobiles. I'd love to have a flying car. Anybody here would like to have a flying car? Yeah, there's huge demand for pretty much anything, right? That's cool and innovative. But it turns out that you get a lot of innovation here and you don't get a lot of innovation in a lot of other areas in our lives. I would argue that the reason you get it here is because this industry has the least amount of coercion, the least amount of regulations, the least amount of controls. They are the most free to do what they want to do. Steve Jobs didn't have to get permission from a regulator to build an iPhone. He didn't need to get permission. But when people write apps for this, they don't need to get permission to write the app for it. They just do. So even within a country like America, there's some industries that are heavily, heavily regulated and others that are not. The ones that are not is where you get the innovation, where you get the progress. So why do we have so many controls, so many limitations? 50-50, right? Why do we have that? What is it about, leaving people free to innovate that we find that we resist? Why, real question, why do we regulate and control? Yeah, because we believe, whether it's true or not is a question, but we believe that if we leave people free, if we leave people too free, things will get out of control. People will behave badly, and things will be a mess, right? So we want to have planning. We want to have some controls on what happens. That makes sense? And why do we think things will get out of hand if we leave them uncontrolled? Yeah. You really have to speak up. Yeah. Okay, so the idea, so what you're saying, because I kind of heard half of what you said, the acoustics here work in one direction, not in the other, is that, for example, J.D. Rockefeller kind of abused the system. He had a lot of freedom, and he'd say he exploited his workers, he didn't pay them much, unsafe. Is that what you said? J.D. Rockefeller is a great example of how the way I view history and the way history is taught to you guys is very different. I think J.D. Rockefeller is one of the great heroes of America. There should be statues for him everywhere. People like J.D. Rockefeller made this country. J.D. Rockefeller found, together with a lot of other people, this gucky, yucky black stuff in the ground. Nobody wanted it because you couldn't do anything with it. It was just black goo. For thousands of years, human beings knew about oil and they didn't know what to do with it. It polluted the land. You couldn't grow anything on it. It was awful stuff. And before J.D. Rockefeller, before the oil industry, what happened? How did we light our homes? What do we use for lighting? Candles. But candles were very expensive, so most people didn't have candles. They used different things with oil. You know what oil they used in order to light their homes?
Kerosene?
No, kerosene is what oil. Kerosene is what you get from oil, but from the black gooey stuff. But what kind of oil was used to light homes? Anybody know? What's that? From mammals? Animals, yeah, animal fat. You know what the big animal is that they used to light homes? It was expensive, but a lot of people used it. Whale oil. So they used to slaughter whales all over the world to extract the oil, which they used to light homes, and only the rich could afford it. So how did poor people light their homes? And most people were poor. They didn't. There was no light. So when the sun set, there was no light. You burned wood, which is not very healthy for you, but that's about it. So Rockefeller comes around. People like Rockefeller, but Rockefeller really makes this into an industry and takes this black gooey stuff and turns it into kerosene. And while doing that, makes it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Every single year, he makes it cheaper and cheaper, and he comes to dominate the whole industry. Why does he dominate the whole industry? Because he's really efficient. He's really productive. Huge amount of ingenuity. And it gets cheaper and cheaper, and suddenly, almost everybody can afford to light their home. Everybody's using kerosene. That's how he becomes rich. Generally, how do you become rich? How does somebody become rich? People talk a lot about rich guys. How do you become rich? You start a business. And the only reason a business will be successful is if it makes stuff that people want. And how much are you willing to pay for something that you want? This is kind of an Econ 101 class, right? How much does this cost? The iPhone? About $300, right? How much is this worth to you? Or to your parents who are paying for it? How much, what's that? Your life. Yeah. Well, luckily Apple is not charging you your life for it. And how much is this worth to you? If it costs $300 and you go to the store and you're willing to give up $300 for it, is it worth less than $300? Exactly $300 or more than $300? More. That's why you're willing to give up the $300, right? So you are better off, hopefully, by buying this for $300. That's how you make money. You become rich by producing something that people are willing to pay more for than what it costs you to produce. And if a lot of people are willing to pay you, you make a lot of money. And that's what Rockefeller did. He produced something called kerosene, which lots of people were willing to pay. And because he made it so cheap, the number of people who could pay was huge, millions and millions of people. All you have to make is a little bit of profit over millions and millions of people, and you make a lot of money. But the way you get rich is providing people with a value that they benefit from. Otherwise, you can't get rich. If you produce crummy stuff that nobody wants, you don't make any money. The only way to make money is to make great products that people want to buy and are willing to give up their money for in order to buy. So Rockefeller, who most people view as a villain because he made so much money, I view as a hero because he made so much money. Because the only way to make money is to make everybody's lives better. My life is better because of the iPhone. Thank you, Steve Jobs. My life is better because of oil in my car. I can drive from place to place. Thank you, Rockefeller. We all had lighting. By the way, who competed Rockefeller out of the lighting business? How did Rockefeller lose the lighting business? Because we don't use kerosene anymore. What do we use now? Electricity. Thomas Edison was Rockefeller's biggest competitor and drove him out of business in the kerosene. Luckily, oil can be used for other things other than lighting, like the internal combustion engine, like plastics. Almost everything in this room has oil in it. The chairs have a coating that's made from oil. Everything plastic, this stuff, is oil. It's that gooey black stuff that was in the ground, useless to human beings, is now being turned into this. So, in my view, capitalism to me means freedom. It means freedom of coercion. Is moral and ethical because it leaves us free to make our own choices. And we make our own choices when we're free to make our own choices. Live our own lives the way we want to live our own lives. Life is much better. So I don't buy this idea that if people are not regulated, they exploit. The fact is that Rockefeller's employees all chose to work for Rockefeller. It wasn't slavery. And they chose to work for Rockefeller because he paid better than anybody else. He paid better than what their alternatives were. You might look back at it and say it wasn't very much, but they were making less before they went to work for Rockefeller. Otherwise, why would they go? Rockefeller improved the lives of millions and millions of people. And to me, that's what happens when you don't have the regulations, when you don't have the constraints. It's not abuse that happens. It's flourishing, it's prosperity, it's success. And to me, the standard of morality, the standard for what's good, the standard for what's ethical, is what leads to individual human flourishing, what leads to individual human success. And capitalism, free markets, have an unbelievable record of leading to human success in history and today, wherever they are tried. And when you if you move from 50-50, controls versus freedom, to more freedom, we will be more successful. When you move away from freedom, you become less successful. All right, so we take questions? Sure. Any questions?